The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Palazzo Vecchio as Lorenzo examined the leather-bound manuscript that would change his understanding of power forever. The year was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli had just completed his most controversial work, yet the true genius of his method lay not in the pages of The Prince, but in the living example he had become through his own transformation. Lorenzo had always believed that power came from achieving goals, conquering territories, accumulating wealth, building alliances. Like most men of his time, he thought strength meant never showing weakness, never admitting fault, never allowing others to see the cracks in his armor. He was about to learn that everything he believed about power was fundamentally wrong. The manuscript before him contained observations that went far beyond political maneuvering. Machiavelli had discovered something profound. The man who clings to his weak self, his comfortable illusions, his need to be right, his fear of appearing vulnerable, becomes a slave to circumstances. But the man who willingly destroys that weak self, who rebuilds himself from the ground up based on reality rather than wishful thinking, becomes truly indestructible. Machiavelli's exile had taught him this lesson through bitter experience. When the Medici returned to power in Florence, they stripped him of his position, his wealth, his influence. Everything he thought defined him was gone. Most men would have been broken by such a fall. Instead, Machiavelli used it as an opportunity for complete transformation. In his modest house outside Florence, far from the corridors of power he once walked, Machiavelli began to understand that his attachment to his former self had been his greatest weakness. His need to be seen as important, his desire for others' approval, his fear of losing status, these had made him vulnerable to forces beyond his control. When those external validations were stripped away, he faced a choice: cling to the wreckage of his old identity or forge something entirely new. The process of self-destruction he undertook was not physical but psychological. He systematically examined every belief, every assumption, every source of identity he had previously relied upon. He questioned his need for others' validation, his attachment to particular outcomes, his very conception of what it meant to be powerful. Lorenzo found himself drawn into Machiavelli's account of this transformation. The exiled statesman described how he spent his days in rigorous self-examination, stripping away layer after layer of what he had previously considered essential to his being. He challenged his need to be liked, his desire to appear virtuous in others' eyes, his fear of being wrong. Each comfortable illusion he destroyed made him stronger, more adaptable, more truly free. The key insight that emerged from this process was revolutionary: most people's pursuit of power is actually a pursuit of weakness. They seek external validation, try to control outcomes, build their identity around things that can be taken away. They set goals and, then, become slaves to those goals, allowing their worth to be determined by their success or failure in achieving them. Machiavelli realized that true power comes not from controlling external circumstances but from becoming immune to their control over you. When you destroy your weak self, the part of you that needs others' approval, that fears loss, that clings to specific outcomes, you become genuinely powerful because there is nothing left to threaten. This understanding transformed everything about how Machiavelli approached human relationships and political maneuvering. He no longer needed to win every argument because his identity wasn't tied to being right. He no longer feared losing because he had already lost everything and discovered that his core self remained intact. He no longer needed others' approval because he had learned to validate himself through clear-eyed assessment of reality. The manuscript detailed specific techniques Machiavelli had developed for this transformation. He practiced what he called identity fasting, deliberately putting himself in situations where his usual sources of validation were absent. He would spend days among people who knew nothing of his former importance, forcing himself to find value in the present moment rather than in past achievements. He developed exercises in outcome independence, training himself to pursue courses of action while remaining genuinely unattached to their success. He would write letters knowing they might never be sent, develop strategies knowing they might never be implemented, engage in conversations without needing to persuade or win. Most importantly, he cultivated what he termed radical honesty with reality. This meant accepting uncomfortable truths about himself, about others, about the world. He practiced seeing people and situations exactly as they were rather than as he wished them to be. This clear vision became the foundation of his real power. Lorenzo began to understand that Machiavelli's famous advice about princes was actually a blueprint for personal transformation. When Machiavelli wrote about the importance of being both fox and lion, he wasn't just describing political tactics. The fox represented the intelligence that comes from destroying illusions and seeing clearly. The lion represented the courage that comes from having nothing left to lose because you've already voluntarily destroyed everything you thought you needed. The document described how this transformation affected Machiavelli's relationships with others. People who had previously held power over him through his need for their approval found themselves dealing with someone fundamentally changed. He could now interact with them from a position of genuine strength because he no longer needed anything from them except what served his actual purposes. This didn't make him cold or manipulative in the common sense. Instead, it made him more genuine in his relationships because he was no longer performing for others' approval. He could afford to be honest because he wasn't protecting a fragile ego. He could afford to admit mistakes because his identity wasn't threatened by being wrong. The transformation also changed how he handled conflict and opposition. Previously, attacks on his position or character would have triggered defensive responses, attempts to justify himself, counterattacks designed to protect his image. Now, such attacks simply provided information about the attacker while leaving his core self untouched. Machiavelli discovered that when you stop defending an image and start operating from authentic strength, opposition often dissolves. People who had previously seen him as a threat began to see him as an ally because he was no longer competing with them for validation or status. Those who continued to oppose him found themselves fighting shadows because there was nothing solid for them to grip and break. The manuscript explored how this principle applied beyond personal relationships to larger questions of strategy and influence. Machiavelli realized that most people's attempts to gain power fail because they're trying to build something on the foundation of their weak self. They want to become powerful while remaining fundamentally unchanged, which is impossible. True power requires the death of the person you were and the birth of someone new. This isn't about adopting a persona or learning new tactics. It's about fundamentally restructuring how you relate to yourself and the world. It means becoming someone who genuinely doesn't need power in the conventional sense because they've found something more valuable, complete freedom from the fears and needs that drive most human behavior. Lorenzo found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about leadership and influence. He had spent years trying to accumulate power through traditional means, building alliances, accumulating resources, positioning himself advantageously in various hierarchies. Reading Machiavelli's account, he began to see these efforts as elaborate forms of weakness disguised as strength. The document revealed that Machiavelli's real genius lay not in his political insights but in his understanding of human psychology. He had discovered that most people are prisoners of their own need systems, their need to be liked, to be right, to win, to maintain their image, to control outcomes. These needs make them predictable and, therefore, manipulable. But, the person who has systematically destroyed these needs becomes unpredictable and, therefore, powerful. They can afford to take risks others won't take because they have less to lose. They can see opportunities others miss because they're not blinded by what they want to see. They can make alliances others can't make because they're not limited by pride or prejudice. The transformation Machiavelli described wasn't comfortable or easy. It required confronting everything he had used to define himself and finding the courage to let it go. It meant accepting that much of what he had previously considered important was actually trivial. It meant learning to find satisfaction and meaning in reality as it is rather than as he wished it to be. But, the rewards of this transformation were immense. Machiavelli found himself with a kind of power he had never imagined possible, the power to remain calm in chaos, to see clearly in confusion, to act decisively when others were paralyzed by fear or hope. He had become, in his own words, a man whom fortune cannot touch because he has already accepted his fate. The manuscript described specific incidents where this new form of power manifested. When former allies turned against him, Machiavelli felt no betrayal because he had no expectation of loyalty based on past favors. When enemies offered reconciliation, he felt no gratitude because he hadn't been depending on their approval. He could evaluate each situation purely on its merits without emotional distortion. This clarity of vision extended to his understanding of others. Having stripped away his own illusions, he could see through others' illusions as well. He understood that most people's actions were driven by the same needs and fears he had transcended. This made their behavior predictable and gave him enormous strategic advantages. Lorenzo realized that what Machiavelli was describing was not just a personal transformation but a complete reorientation toward reality itself. Instead of trying to make reality conform to his desires, Machiavelli had learned to align himself with reality and draw power from that alignment. This didn't mean passive acceptance of circumstances. On the contrary, it meant becoming far more effective at influencing circumstances because his actions were based on clear perception rather than wishful thinking. He could invest his energy in what was actually possible rather than wasting it on what he wished were possible. The document explored how this transformation affected Machiavelli's relationship with fear and desire, the twin forces that drive most human behavior. Having voluntarily confronted his deepest fears and given up his most cherished desires, he found himself immune to manipulation by others through either emotion. People who tried to threaten him discovered there was nothing he wouldn't survive because he had already survived the loss of everything he thought he needed. People who tried to tempt him discovered there was nothing he needed to have because he had learned to find satisfaction in what was already present. This freedom from fear and desire didn't make him inhuman. Instead, it made him more genuinely human because he was no longer performing a role or protecting an image. He could respond to each situation from authentic strength rather than from the weakness of needing to appear strong. As Lorenzo read deeper into the manuscript, he began to understand that Machiavelli's method offered something far more valuable than traditional notions of power or success. It offered genuine freedom from the internal forces that enslave most people to circumstances beyond their control. The first part of the document concluded with Machiavelli's reflection on the paradox of power. The man who seeks power over others remains a slave to his own needs. But the man who gains power over himself discovers that others naturally align themselves with his strength. True power is never taken, it is recognized and acknowledged by others who sense the presence of someone who has transcended the common human weaknesses that limit us all. Lorenzo set down the manuscript with a profound sense of unease. Everything he had believed about strength and weakness, about power and vulnerability, had been challenged. He was beginning to understand that his entire approach to life had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what real power actually meant. The transformation Machiavelli described seemed both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it required giving up everything he had used to define himself. Liberating because it promised a kind of strength that couldn't be taken away by circumstances or other people. As the shadows lengthened in the palazzo, Lorenzo found himself at a crossroads. He could continue pursuing power in the traditional way, accumulating external advantages while remaining internally vulnerable. Or he could begin the difficult process of transformation that Machiavelli had outlined, destroying his weak self to discover what true strength might feel like. The choice before him was not just about political strategy or personal advancement. It was about what kind of person he would choose to become and what kind of life he would choose to live. The manuscript had shown him a possibility he had never imagined, becoming truly indestructible not by building impenetrable defenses but by having nothing left to defend. The sun was setting over Florence, and Lorenzo knew that whatever decision he made in the coming days would determine not just his future success but the very nature of who he would become. Machiavelli's method offered power beyond anything he had previously imagined, but it demanded a price that most men would never be willing to pay: the complete destruction and rebuilding of the self. Lorenzo spent the following weeks in a state of profound contemplation, unable to escape the implications of what he had read. The second part of Machiavelli's manuscript arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by the same anonymous messenger who had brought the first. This section delved deeper into the practical methodology of self-transformation, revealing the specific techniques Machiavelli had developed during his years of exile. The opening pages described what Machiavelli called the Great Inventory, a systematic cataloging of every source of personal vulnerability. This wasn't merely an intellectual exercise but a brutal honest assessment of every way in which external circumstances could control his emotions, decisions, and sense of self-worth. Machiavelli had divided his vulnerabilities into several categories: social dependencies, identity attachments, outcome expectations, and fear-based motivations. Under social dependencies, he listed his need for others' approval, his fear of social rejection, his desire to be seen as important or successful. These dependencies had made him a puppet of others' opinions, constantly adjusting his behavior to maintain their good regard. Identity attachments proved even more insidious. Machiavelli realized he had built his sense of self around temporary roles and circumstances: his position in government, his reputation as a diplomat, his image as an intellectual. When these external markers were stripped away, he had felt as though he ceased to exist. This attachment to a constructed identity had been his greatest source of weakness. Outcome expectations had created another form of slavery. Machiavelli discovered that his emotional state had become entirely dependent on external results over which he had only partial control. When negotiations succeeded, he felt powerful. When projects failed, he felt worthless. This emotional volatility made him vulnerable to manipulation by anyone who could influence his circumstances. Fear-based motivations revealed the deepest level of his psychological prison. His fear of poverty drove him to seek security through political favor. His fear of irrelevance compelled him to involve himself in intrigues that served others' interests more than his own. His fear of death made him cling to a life that had become increasingly hollow and constrained. The manuscript detailed the systematic process by which Machiavelli began to destroy these sources of vulnerability. He called it strategic self-deprivation, deliberately placing himself in situations where his usual crutches were unavailable. He would spend days among people who knew nothing of his former importance, forcing himself to find value in the present moment rather than in past achievements. During these exercises, Machiavelli discovered something remarkable: when his external sources of validation were removed, an internal source of strength emerged that he had never recognized. Stripped of his titles and reputation, he found himself more genuinely confident than he had ever been while possessing them. Removed from the games of court politics, he developed clearer thinking than he had ever achieved while playing them. This internal strength wasn't based on positive thinking or self-affirmation. It emerged from radical acceptance of reality, including the reality of his own limitations and mortality. When he stopped fighting against uncomfortable truths about himself and his circumstances, he discovered that these truths couldn't actually harm him. They could only harm the false image of himself he had been protecting. The process of transformation required what Machiavelli termed identity dissolution, the systematic dismantling of every aspect of personality that depended on external circumstances for its existence. This wasn't about becoming emotionless or detached, but about finding the core of himself that existed independently of social roles, achievements, or others' opinions. Lorenzo found himself drawn into detailed descriptions of specific techniques Machiavelli had developed. One involved perspective rotation, deliberately viewing himself and his circumstances from different angles to break his attachment to any single narrative about his life. He would imagine how his story might be told by his enemies, by future historians, by complete strangers. This exercise revealed how much of his self-concept was simply one possible interpretation among many. Another technique involved temporal displacement, imagining how his current concerns would appear from the perspective of 10 years in the future, or how they would matter to someone living a century later. This practice helped him distinguish between what was genuinely important and what merely felt urgent because of his current emotional state. The most challenging technique was what Machiavelli called voluntary adversity, deliberately seeking out situations that challenged his comfort and forced him to develop new capabilities. Instead of avoiding circumstances that made him feel uncertain or vulnerable, he began to pursue them as opportunities for growth. Through this process, Machiavelli discovered that most of what people call strength is actually elaborate weakness in disguise. The person who cannot bear criticism is not strong but fragile. The person who needs to win every argument is not powerful but desperate. The person who cannot admit mistakes is not confident but terrified. True strength, he realized, came from being able to absorb any experience without it damaging your essential self. This required developing what he called psychological anti-fragility, the ability to grow stronger under stress rather than weaker. Just as physical muscles develop through resistance training, psychological strength developed through deliberately engaging with challenging experiences. The manuscript described how this transformation affected Machiavelli's relationships with former colleagues who still possessed political power. When he encountered them at social gatherings, they expected to find a broken man, desperate for their favor and bitter about his fall from grace. Instead, they found someone who seemed more substantial and grounded than he had ever appeared during his years of influence. This confusion arose because they were encountering someone who no longer needed anything from them except honest interaction. Machiavelli could afford to be direct where previously he had been diplomatic. He could afford to be wrong where previously he had been defensive. He could afford to be genuine where previously he had been calculating. The irony was profound. By giving up his attempts to manipulate and control others, he had become far more influential than when those attempts had been his primary strategy. People found themselves drawn to his clarity and honesty precisely because it was so rare among those who still pursued conventional power. The document revealed that this transformation had not been quick or easy. Machiavelli described months of internal struggle as he worked to release attachments that had defined him for decades. There were periods of profound disorientation as old patterns of thought and behavior dissolved before new ones had fully formed. He experienced what he called identity vertigo, moments when he felt as though he no longer knew who he was or what mattered to him. During these periods, he had to resist the temptation to grab onto familiar sources of identity, even though they had proven to be sources of weakness. The breakthrough came when Machiavelli realized that the disorientation itself was valuable. The person who always knows who they are has stopped growing. The person who is certain about what they want has stopped learning. The capacity to exist comfortably in uncertainty was itself a form of strength that most people never develop. This understanding transformed his relationship with change and unpredictability. Instead of seeing them as threats to be defended against, he began to see them as opportunities for continued growth and adaptation. The person who has transcended the need for psychological security can thrive in any environment because they carry their stability within themselves. The manuscript explored how this internal transformation manifested in external behavior. Machiavelli found that he could now engage with any situation or person without becoming emotionally invested in particular outcomes. This didn't make him indifferent but allowed him to remain clear-thinking and strategic even in highly charged situations. When former enemies attacked his character or reputation, he felt no need to defend himself because his sense of worth was no longer dependent on their opinions. When allies disappointed him, he felt no betrayal because he had no expectations based on past loyalty. This emotional independence gave him enormous strategic advantages because his decisions were based on clear assessment rather than emotional reaction. The document detailed specific examples of how this transformation manifested in practical situations. During a tense negotiation between rival factions in Florence, Machiavelli had been called upon to mediate despite his official exile from politics. Everyone expected him to use the opportunity to advance his own interests or settle old scores. Instead, he approached the situation with complete neutrality, focusing solely on finding solutions that served the broader good of the city. His lack of personal agenda was so apparent that both sides began to trust him in ways they trusted no one else involved. The negotiation succeeded precisely because he was the only person in the room who didn't need it to succeed for personal reasons. This pattern repeated in various contexts. Machiavelli discovered that when you stop pursuing power over others, others naturally grant you influence. When you stop needing to be right, others start seeking your judgment. When you stop defending your reputation improves. The paradox was that the very things most people pursue through elaborate strategies and manipulations naturally flow toward those who have transcended the need for them. But this only works when the transcendence is genuine, not when it's performed as another form of strategy. Lorenzo found himself studying Machiavelli's description of what he called authentic presence, the quality that emerges when someone has aligned their external behavior with their internal reality. Most people, Machiavelli observed, are constantly performing versions of themselves designed to create particular impressions on others. This performance requires enormous energy and creates constant anxiety about whether the performance is succeeding. The person who has destroyed their false self no longer needs to perform. They can simply be present in each moment, responding authentically to whatever arises. This authenticity is immediately recognizable to others and tends to evoke their own authenticity in response. The manuscript described how this quality affected even casual social interactions. People found themselves confiding in Machiavelli, seeking his advice, feeling comfortable in his presence in ways that surprised them. This wasn't because he was trying to create these effects but because his genuine presence created space for others to be genuine as well. This principle extended to more formal relationships and negotiations. When dealing with someone who has no hidden agenda and no need to manipulate or control, others often discover that they too can afford to be straightforward. The reduction in defensive posturing and strategic maneuvering makes it possible to address real issues and find genuine solutions. The document explored the relationship between this personal transformation and traditional political power. Machiavelli had initially worried that his loss of conventional influence would make him irrelevant to the great events of his time. Instead, he discovered that his freedom from the constraints that limited others made him more valuable as an advisor and mediator. Political leaders who were trapped by their own needs for validation, their fears of loss, and their attachments to particular outcomes found themselves seeking counsel from someone who could see their situations clearly precisely because he wasn't emotionally invested in any particular result. This consultative role proved more satisfying and, ultimately, more influential than his previous position as a direct participant in political machinations. He could now offer advice based purely on strategic merit rather than on how it would affect his own position. This objectivity made his counsel far more valuable and sought after. The manuscript revealed that Machiavelli had begun to see his exile not as a punishment but as a liberation. The loss of everything he thought he needed had freed him to discover what he actually needed, which turned out to be far less than he had imagined. The destruction of his external identity had revealed an internal identity that was far more robust and adaptable. This realization led to what he called the second birth, the emergence of a self that was defined not by circumstances but by consciousness. This new self could adapt to any situation because it wasn't dependent on any particular situation for its existence or value. Lorenzo began to understand that what Machiavelli was describing was not just a personal transformation but a completely different way of being human. Most people live as prisoners of their own psychological patterns, slaves to needs and fears they haven't examined, victims of circumstances they can't control because they've never learned to control themselves. The person who has mastered the art of self-destruction and reconstruction becomes something qualitatively different, not superhuman, but genuinely human in a way that transcends the common limitations that constrain most people's lives. The second part of the manuscript concluded with Machiavelli's reflection on the nature of true invincibility. The man who can be destroyed by loss of wealth was never truly wealthy. The man who can be destroyed by loss of position was never truly powerful. The man who can be destroyed by others' opinions was never truly himself. But the man who has voluntarily destroyed all these false securities and found that his essential self remains intact has discovered something that cannot be taken away because it was never dependent on external circumstances. As Lorenzo finished reading, he realized that he was facing the most important decision of his life. The path Machiavelli described was not easy or comfortable. It required giving up everything he had used to define success and value. But it offered something in return that he had never imagined possible: genuine freedom from the forces that had controlled him throughout his life. The evening light was fading as Lorenzo contemplated the choice before him. He could continue living as he always had, pursuing traditional forms of power while remaining vulnerable to circumstances beyond his control. Or he could begin the challenging process of transformation that would require destroying everything he thought he was to discover what he actually might become. The third part of Machiavelli's manuscript awaited, promising to reveal the ultimate implications of this transformation and its applications in the world of action and influence. But Lorenzo already understood that whatever practical techniques it might contain, the real power lay in the fundamental shift of consciousness that Machiavelli had achieved, the movement from being someone who tried to control his circumstances to being someone whom circumstances could not control. The final part of Machiavelli's manuscript arrived as winter settled over Florence, brought by the same mysterious courier who had delivered the previous sections. Lorenzo had spent weeks integrating the insights from the earlier parts, beginning his own tentative experiments with the techniques Machiavelli had described. What he discovered in the concluding section would complete his understanding of the profound transformation that was possible when one truly embraced the principle of strategic self-destruction. This final document opened with Machiavelli's most radical insight: the complete inversion of conventional wisdom about strength and vulnerability. Everything that society taught about power was not merely wrong but actively counterproductive. The very pursuit of traditional forms of strength was what created and maintained weakness. Machiavelli had come to understand that the human ego, the constructed self that most people spend their lives protecting and promoting, was not an asset but a liability. It was a collection of vulnerabilities masquerading as identity. Every attachment, every need for validation, every fear of loss was a point of leverage that others could use to control and manipulate. The manuscript detailed what Machiavelli called the paradox of invincibility. The only way to become truly strong was to make yourself completely vulnerable first. This meant systematically destroying every psychological defense, every comfortable illusion, every source of false security that the ego had constructed over a lifetime. Most people, Machiavelli observed, spent enormous energy building elaborate psychological fortresses, reputations to protect, relationships to maintain, achievements to preserve, images to uphold. These fortresses felt like sources of strength but actually became prisons. The more you had to defend, the more constrained your actions became. The more you needed to protect, the more vulnerable you were to anyone who could threaten those protections. The person who voluntarily dismantled all these defenses discovered something remarkable: there was nothing underneath that could actually be harmed. The core self that remained after all the psychological construction was stripped away was not vulnerable because it had no need for protection. It simply was, independent of circumstances, opinions, or outcomes. Lorenzo found himself studying Machiavelli's description of life after this transformation. The external circumstances of his existence remained challenging. He was still exiled from formal politics, still struggling financially, still dealing with the same difficult people and complex situations. But his relationship to these circumstances had become fundamentally different. Where previously he had experienced stress, anxiety, and frustration when things didn't go according to his plans, he now felt something closer to curiosity. Each situation became an opportunity to test his new understanding, to see how his transformed consciousness would handle whatever arose. Instead of needing reality to be different than it was, he found himself interested in reality exactly as it was. This shift in orientation had profound practical consequences. When Machiavelli no longer needed negotiations to succeed for his own psychological well-being, he became a far more effective negotiator. When he no longer needed others to like him, his relationships became more genuine and, ultimately, more valuable. When he no longer feared failure, he could take risks that led to much greater successes than his previous cautious strategies had achieved. The manuscript explored what Machiavelli called the multiplication effect of authenticity. When one person in any interaction operates from genuine authenticity rather than from ego-driven agenda, it tends to evoke authenticity in others. This creates a qualitatively different kind of communication and collaboration that is far more productive than the strategic maneuvering that characterizes most human interactions. Business negotiations that had previously taken months to resolve began concluding in days when both parties could speak honestly about their actual needs and constraints rather than posturing for advantage. Political alliances that had seemed impossible became natural when people could acknowledge their real interests without fearing that honesty would be used against them. Machiavelli discovered that the very quality people most feared, being seen as they actually were rather than as they wished to appear, was actually what others most valued and responded to. The courage to be genuine in a world of performance was so rare that it immediately distinguished anyone who possessed it. The document describes specific techniques Machiavelli had developed for maintaining this state of authenticity under pressure. When facing criticism or attack, instead of defending or counterattacking, he practiced what he called absorbing the truth. Every criticism contained some element of accuracy, and, instead of rejecting it to protect his ego, he would extract whatever was valid and integrate it into his understanding of himself. This practice had an extraordinary effect on his critics. When someone is prepared to acknowledge the truth in criticism rather than defending against it, the critic often finds their hostility dissolving. The very thing they expected to hurt had been welcomed and integrated, making further attack pointless and often causing them to reassess their own motivations for the criticism. Similarly, when facing praise or flattery, Machiavelli practiced discounting the illusion. He would extract whatever accurate information the praise contained about the specific value he had provided while discarding the emotional content designed to inflate his ego. This kept him grounded in reality while still being able to learn from others' perspectives on his actions. The manuscript revealed that this transformation had not made Machiavelli passive or withdrawn from worldly affairs. On the contrary, it had made him far more effective in achieving practical results. But, these results now served larger purposes rather than ego-driven needs. Instead of seeking power for its own sake, he found himself naturally drawn toward situations where he could contribute something valuable. This shift from personal ambition to service-oriented action proved to be immensely more satisfying than his previous pursuit of conventional success. When actions are motivated by genuine value creation rather than by need for validation, they tend to be both more effective and more fulfilling. Lorenzo found himself studying Machiavelli's analysis of what he called strategic selflessness, the discovery that the most effective way to achieve one's actual goals was often to transcend the self-centered perspective that had originally generated those goals. When personal ego was removed from strategic thinking, it became possible to see situations far more clearly and to devise solutions that served everyone's genuine interests. This didn't mean becoming altruistic in a conventional sense. Machiavelli remained intensely focused on practical results and strategic advantage. But, his strategy was now based on accurate assessment of reality rather than on ego-driven wishful thinking. This made him far more formidable as an ally and far more dangerous as an adversary, precisely because his actions were unpredictable to those who still operated from ego-based motivations. The manuscript described several incidents where this transformed perspective had created remarkable outcomes. When mediating disputes between merchant families, Machiavelli's lack of personal interest in the outcome allowed him to propose solutions that neither party had considered because they had been too focused on winning rather than on solving the actual problems. In one case, two families had been feuding over trade routes for decades, each trying to exclude the other and gain exclusive access. Machiavelli suggested a partnership structure that gave both families more profit than either could achieve alone, but which neither had considered because their thinking had been constrained by the assumption that one must lose for the other to win. The solution was obvious once it was proposed, but it had been invisible to the feuding parties because their ego-driven need to defeat each other had blinded them to creative alternatives. Machiavelli's freedom from such constraints allowed him to see possibilities that were hidden to those still operating from competitive rather than collaborative consciousness. The document explored how this principle applied to larger political and social issues. Machiavelli observed that most political conflicts persisted not because they were inherently unsolvable but because the parties involved were more invested in being right than in being effective. Their identity had become attached to particular positions, making it psychologically impossible for them to consider alternatives even when those alternatives would better serve their actual interests. The person who had transcended such identity attachments could often find solutions that served everyone's genuine needs precisely because they weren't constrained by the need to maintain any particular position or image. This made them invaluable as mediators and advisors in complex situations. Lorenzo began to understand that what Machiavelli was describing was not just a personal transformation but a completely different way of engaging with power and influence. Traditional approaches to power were based on accumulation, gathering resources, building networks, establishing advantages over others. This approach inevitably created resistance and conflict because it was based on zero-sum thinking. The transformed approach to power was based on alignment, finding ways to serve genuine value while transcending personal agenda. This approach often created multiplication rather than competition because it wasn't limited by the assumption that one person's gain must come at another's expense. The manuscript detailed what Machiavelli called the Aikido principle, the practice of using the force and momentum of opposition to achieve one's objectives rather than meeting force with force. When someone attacked his position or character, instead of defending or counterattacking, he would redirect their energy in directions that served his actual purposes. This wasn't manipulation in the conventional sense because it didn't involve deception or hidden agenda. It was simply the skillful use of natural principles, the fact that energy can be redirected more efficiently than it can be stopped, that people's own motivations can be aligned with your objectives more effectively than they can be overcome. The document provided specific examples of how this principle worked in practice. When a political rival attempted to discredit Machiavelli by spreading rumors about his loyalty to Florence, instead of denying the accusations, Machiavelli used them as an opportunity to publicly clarify his actual political philosophy. The resulting discussion elevated his reputation far more than the rival's attack could have damaged it. In another instance, when a former ally attempted to exclude Machiavelli from an important negotiation by arguing that his exile made him unsuitable, Machiavelli agreed with the assessment and recommended someone else for the position, while also suggesting that his own outsider status might make him valuable as an informal advisor who could speak to all parties without representing any particular faction. This led to his inclusion in the process in a role that gave him more influence than the formal position would have provided. The manuscript revealed that these techniques worked not through cleverness or manipulation but through alignment with deeper principles of human psychology and social dynamics. People instinctively trusted those who demonstrated no hidden agenda. They naturally deferred to those who showed genuine competence without ego-driven need for recognition. They spontaneously cooperated with those who facilitated their own success without demanding credit. Lorenzo found himself studying Machiavelli's description of what he called invisible leadership, the ability to guide situations and influence outcomes without needing to be recognized as the leader. This form of influence was far more powerful than conventional leadership because it didn't trigger the resistance that formal authority often provoked. The invisible leader worked by asking the right questions rather than providing answers, by creating conditions for others' success rather than seeking their own advancement, by facilitating solutions rather than imposing them. This approach was only possible for someone who had transcended the ego's need for recognition and control. The document explored how this transformation affected Machiavelli's relationship with mortality and legacy. Having destroyed his attachment to conventional forms of success and recognition, he had also transcended the fear of death that drove much of human behavior. This wasn't because he had become indifferent to life but because he had found something within life that was independent of its duration or external circumstances. This freedom from mortality anxiety had profound practical implications. Most people's strategic thinking was constrained by their fear of loss of position, reputation, resources, or life itself. These fears made them predictable and manipulable. The person who had genuinely transcended such fears became genuinely unpredictable and, therefore, possessed enormous strategic advantages. Machiavelli could take risks others wouldn't take because he had already accepted the worst possible outcomes. He could make sacrifices others couldn't make because he wasn't attached to what he was sacrificing. He could commit fully to courses of action others would approach tentatively because he had no reservations based on fear of failure. The manuscript described how this transformation had affected Machiavelli's creative and intellectual work. Freed from the need to protect his reputation or conform to others' expectations, he found himself able to explore ideas and express insights that would have been too dangerous or controversial for his previous, more constrained self. The very works that would ensure his lasting influence, including The Prince, could only have been written by someone who had transcended the need for contemporary approval. The willingness to express uncomfortable truths about power and human nature required a form of courage that was only possible for someone who had already lost everything they thought they needed to protect. Lorenzo began to understand that Machiavelli's greatest insight was not any particular technique or strategy but the recognition that most human potential was constrained not by external circumstances but by internal limitations. The person who learned to transcend these self-imposed limitations could operate in a completely different dimension of possibility. The document concluded with Machiavelli's reflection on the ultimate implications of his transformation. I have discovered that the man who can destroy himself can create himself. The man who can lose everything can gain everything. The man who needs nothing is offered everything. The man who fears nothing can accomplish anything. This is the final paradox of power. It belongs completely only to those who have transcended the need to possess it. The manuscript ended with specific guidance for those who might wish to undertake their own transformation. Machiavelli warned that the process could not be approached as another form of strategy or technique. It required genuine willingness to surrender everything one had used to define oneself, without guarantee of what would emerge from that surrender. The transformation could not be faked or performed. It required actual vulnerability, actual loss, actual confrontation with one's deepest fears and attachments. But, for those who had the courage to undertake this process authentically, the rewards were beyond anything that conventional approaches to power and success could provide. As Lorenzo finished reading the final pages, he understood that he had been given something far more valuable than political advice or strategic techniques. He had been shown a completely different way of being human, one that transcended the limitations that constrained most people's lives and opened up possibilities that he had never imagined. The choice before him was clear but not easy. He could continue living as he always had, pursuing traditional forms of power while remaining vulnerable to forces beyond his control. Or he could begin the challenging but ultimately liberating process of voluntary self-destruction that would reveal what genuine invincibility actually meant. Outside the palazzo, the winter wind was growing stronger, and Lorenzo could hear it testing every window and door. But, for the first time in his life, he felt no anxiety about what storms might come. He had learned that true shelter was not something that could be built from external materials but something that emerged when one had the courage to stand undefended in whatever weather arose. The man who destroys his weak self, Machiavelli had written, can never be destroyed by others. Lorenzo was beginning to understand what that meant, not as an abstract principle but as a lived reality that was now within his reach if he had the courage to claim it. The transformation awaited, requiring only his willingness to let go of everything he had thought he was to discover what he actually might become.